Thank you all for joining us here on the lunch hour. Um, my name is Chris Kolakowski. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Eric is on vacation this week, so I am pinch hitting for him along with Molly Snow, who will be handling some of the questions and some of the logistical piece. But it's great to see all of you here for what promises to be an outstanding presentation by a great scholar, John McManus, and his history of the Pacific War, of the U.S. Army of the Pacific in 1944. I did want to mention, if you could leave your microphones muted during the presentation. If you have any questions along the way, please put them in chat. Please give them to Molly. She will compile them, and then we'll filter them to John at the end of his presentation. I'd also like to thank the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation and Generac Power Systems, and without their support, we wouldn't be able to put on such great programs like this. And so with that, I will introduce our speaker and give the floor over to him. So John McManus, as you can see there, is the distinguished professor at the Missouri University of Science and Technology outside of St. Louis. I won't make any St. Louis comments because there are, as you can imagine, there's a little bit of a rivalry between Milwaukee and Wisconsin and Missouri. But anyway, I've known John for several years now. I was thinking about it. It's been probably 5 or 6 years when we first met researching at the Macarthur Memorial. When he was starting on the first of what ultimately is going to be 3 volumes, The History of the U.S. Army in the Pacific. It was supposed to be 2, but as I suspected, and I'm glad to see, John found so much and couldn't do the Army in the Pacific justice in just 2 volumes, so he's going to be doing 3. And John has written multiple books. One of the other ones that might be of interest for the Veterans Museum audience actually deals with one of our exhibits, our Battle of the Bulge exhibit, is Alamo of the Ardennes and the stand of the 110th Infantry, which we have on display in the museum. So I recommend you checking out his books. He's a great scholar and a great storyteller. And as I mentioned today, he's talking about his latest book, Island Infernos, the U.S. Army's Pacific War Odyssey, 1944. And so with that, John, the floor is yours.
Chris, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I know you're a Chicago Blackhawks fan, so that's maybe the nicest thing a Blackhawks fan has ever said about me. So I do appreciate that. Such a pleasure to be here with you and everybody else. Apologize for my little war wound here. I was about with a dermatologist, nothing glamorous, of course. And the dermatologist got the better of it, but I think she's incredibly skilled because she succeeded in making me even uglier than I was before, and that does take skill. So thank you for showing up today, and for your interest in the topic. Basically, I just want to take you into the Army's world in the Pacific in 1944. At that point, the Army is on the cusp of full maturity, and it's spread out, just in all of these places over, almost 1/3 of the world's surface of ocean and island. So much so that, as Chris had mentioned, this became a standalone volume of its own, the Army's experience in 1944, because so much was going on. But, you've got Army garrisons or combat divisions or whatever spread out in far and wide, from the Aleutian Islands to the Hawaiian Islands, of course, the South Pacific, New Guinea. The Army's involved, obviously, in the China-Burma-India campaign, too, which, of course, Chris had just written about in his most recent book. It's an army at the beginning of 1944 that's swollen to about 700,000 soldiers. And again, spread out over this vast array of map here. And it's an army of such size, of course, that there's no possibility that any one commander is going to control the whole thing. And part of that has to do, too, with the fact that the Army and Navy leaders decided that they were going to split up the theater among them. There's a sort of uneasy compromise. But in the course of the war, and I really think this is overlooked, and it's one of the reasons why I approached this topic, in the course of the war, 1.8 million Army ground soldiers served in the Pacific Asia theater. That's the 3rd largest army this country has ever sent overseas to fight a war, behind only the European theater armies in World Wars I and II. And yet, there is, I think, a sense that still persists in our sort of popular memory of World War II and popular culture that the United States Army focused on Europe in World War II, and that the Marine Corps did the ground fighting in the Pacific. And of course, that just couldn't be further from the truth. The Army actually did the vast majority of the fighting and quite a bit of the dying in the war against Japan. The Army comprised about 21 infantry and airborne divisions, plus assorted independent combat teams whose manpower equated to probably at least 4 more divisions. And by the way, this doesn't include the Army Air Forces, which, of course, the Air Force was part of the Army in World War II. So I'm only including Army ground forces and service forces of ground soldiers. The Marine Corps, by contrast, mobilized at full strength. The largest it's ever been was World War II, and it had 6 divisions. It was about 250,000 Marines, roughly, something like that. So what you're seeing there is that the Marine Corps is much smaller than the Army, of course, by design. And of course, in pointing all this out of how the Army and theater kind of dwarfs the Marine Corps, I'm not at all denigrating the Marine Corps, quite the contrary. Actually, when you get a sense of this larger context, I think you come away with an even deeper respect for the Marine Corps, really punching above its weight and playing such a major role in the war. So the purpose of the series is not at all to denigrate the Marine Corps, quite the contrary, but also show that the 2 ground-oriented services fought together in so many different battles, and that there was very few exclusively Marine Corps battles. And in fact, the Army did most of the fighting, but also did a lot of the really unglamorous but incredibly necessary service-oriented work, the engineering, the transportation, the unloading, the quartermasters, all of this kind of stuff that had to be done. But it also carried out most of the amphibious operations. Give you a little example. In the entirety of the war, the Marine Corps carried out 15 amphibious assault operations. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army alone carried out 35 in the Philippines over a 5-week span in the spring of 1945. Of varying sizes, of course, but it does give you a sense of the incredible amphibious capability that the United States Army had at that point. Toward the end of the war, I would argue more so than any other military organization on the planet. And I'm talking about guys like this. These are guys from the 7th Infantry Division who were fighting at Kwajalein in early 1944. Very unglamorous places that we don't tend to remember. They're not iconic like Normandy or the Bulge or whatever. But to these guys, of course, this is every bit as important, and it really is, in terms of deciding the outcome of the war. So the first image that you saw there is 7th Infantry Division soldiers on Kwajalein. This is 77th Infantry Division soldiers on Guam. So it just gives you a little sampling of all these places where you might have fought as an Army soldier at that time. 42,000 Army ground soldiers did not survive the war, felled by combat, disease, accidents, terrible privation of captivity. The majority of the POWs who were in Japanese hands were Army soldiers. It was a harvest of death that, think about this, totaled more than the entirety of any previous American conflict, except for, of course, World War I and the Civil War. So just the Army alone sees more guys die in World War II than you'd had in the entirety of any American war previously, except, of course, for those 2 big ones, the Civil War and World War I. So it gives you a little perspective there, too. So, as 1944 begins, thousands of them were already moldering in graves all over that part of the planet, from Guinea to the Solomon Islands to the Hawaiian Islands to Attu and wherever else. So what kind of missions was the Army doing? It's just a staggering array. And it almost just kind of boggles your mind when you start to kind of dive into it. The Army's involved, of course, in grand strategical planning, a lot of inter-service coordination. Of course, you saw the map a moment ago. You're not going anywhere without the Navy. I mean, the Pacific War to some extent is a naval war, but in the end, the ground has to be taken and it has to be held. And obviously that's where the Army comes into the equation, but you've got to work closely with the Navy. And so you have a lot of Army and Navy officers who really understand how to work well together in the course of the war. And of course, in fighting many of the battles, you're fighting alongside the Marine Corps. And that too takes a lot of inter-service coordination. And I argue in my series that the Marines and the Army actually fought very similarly. There weren't that many differences as often presupposed, and they tended to get along very well, especially where there was good leadership, which tended to happen. A lot of diplomacy among services, diplomacy among allies, joint operations with allies, especially, of course, with the Australians early in the war, with, of course, the Chinese in the course of the war, There's a lot of this kind of diplomacy that's going on, and a lot of inter-allied stuff. The last war this country fought exclusively on its own without allies is the Spanish-American War. So this is very much part of modern America. Logistics. I mean, the vast logistics of fighting in a theater like that, where everything has to be moved, everything has to be built. There's no infrastructure in so many of these spots. And so you're having to kind of create it out of whole cloth. The logistical effort is just beyond belief. The transportation, the Army even has its own little mini Navy of small boats that it's using to move supplies. And of course, the trucking and whatever else that is necessary, the engineering, which of course, I think this tends to be overlooked, that the Army as a whole in both theaters just is on a different planet in terms of its engineering capability than most military organizations by the end of World War II. And you see this manifest, especially like in river crossings in the European theater. In the Pacific theater, you see that, but also a lot of dealing with swamps and also building of coastal bases, building of airfields. Of course, a lot of combat-oriented engineering too, in terms of like using flamethrowers and explosives in order to fight close quarters. So the engineering side of this is just vast and it's staggering. Intel gathering, guerrilla warfare, of course, guerrilla warfare most notably in the Philippines, but also some other spots too, like North Burma. So you're seeing that too, and you're seeing the beginnings of Army soldiers serving in a similar capacity to what you'll later see from Special Forces. You have civil affairs, of course, medical. The medical side is just massive. I would argue it's the largest medical effort in military history at this point, up to this point in time. And I'm saying in tandem, the Army in both theaters, but especially in the Pacific theater, where in many cases, it's just hard to exist in malaria-ridden areas and whatever else. So it's just a struggle of survival. And, of course, dealing with captivity is part of the Army's experience, ground combat operations of every type and description. So you're seeing too, a really uneasy kind of harbinger with the nature of the combat, a kind of a kill or be killed environment. Most of the time the Japanese are going to elect to fight to the death and not really want to surrender. The Americans often want to oblige them. And of course the Japanese are going to fight with the kind of rules that the Americans would like to have in warfare. And by that, I mean like respecting medics and whatnot. And really that's a harbinger for the way most of America's enemies have fought ever since. And so it forces the Americans then to kind of come to terms with what are their own scruples and what rules of war do they have. And there's a lot of moral ambiguities to this. So I don't propose to, of course, walk you through all of the Army's 44 experiences. For that, obviously, you have to read the book, and I guarantee you'll enjoy it, but you can get the full story there. But let me just give you some highlights. It maybe just gives you a sense of the larger whole. And of course, when we talk about the Army in the Pacific, we have to start by talking about the Zeus of the theater, certainly as he thought himself, Douglas MacArthur. One of the things that's unique among many about Douglas MacArthur is that he was actually Army Chief of Staff earlier in his career, the #1 position, and now, of course, he's a theater commander. So he's had a long military career, and I won't go into the full background because, of course, that could be a talk in and of itself. But I think many of you know he loves the Philippines, and that's been really his great hope and his great intention since having to leave the Philippines in 1942 when his army was about to go down. He wants to go back. He wants to go back, liberate the archipelago. He believes that the U.S. is honor bound to do this. He believes to the marrow of his bones that this is the wisest play on a grand strategical level. He's an ardent opponent of the Germany first policy. MacArthur is going to argue that America's future lies in Asia and the Pacific, and there was much to recommend that viewpoint, but he also tends to minimize the threat, the strategic threat that Germany had posed too. But he wants priority of resources like any commander. He's deeply worried as 1944 begins that his theater, what was called the Southwest Pacific Area, or SWAPA, is going to be eclipsed by Admiral Chester Nimitz's what's often called Central Pacific Theater, an island hopping campaign that really is aimed straight for Tokyo. Whereas MacArthur is sort of bogged down in New Guinea at the beginning of 1944. So he's worried that he and his theater are going to be sort of consigned to flank protection for Nimitz, and just kind of underfed in that regard. So there's a great quote that his British liaison officer wrote about him. This is Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Wilkinson. And I think it has really penetrating insight about MacArthur. Wilkinson wrote, "He is shrewd, selfish, proud, remote, highly strung, and vastly vain. He has imagination, self-confidence, physical courage, and charm, but no humor about himself, no regard for truth, and is unaware of these defects. With moral depth, he would be a great man. As it is, he's a near miss, which may be worse than a mile. His main ambition would be to end the war as Pan-American hero in the form of Generalissimo of all Pacific theaters." And especially that last part, I think he's dead on with what MacArthur would like, at least in the ideal. So you can see MacArthur here with some of his commanders, most notably here, Lieutenant General Walter Krueger, who is, of course, one of his key ground commanders. And it's a very MacArthur type of pose where he's sort of looking out into the distance, sometimes away from where everybody else is looking. He really has this kind of magisterial, almost stentorian presence. He's very gentlemanly in how he treats people, and yet he can also be very conniving too. But as we go back to our map here, I mean, you can see his theater down here centered on New Guinea, and he hasn't really covered that much ground by early 1944. He's been sort of bogged down in New Guinea for almost a year and a half. He's covered about 350 miles of North New Guinea wasteland. And that represents about a third of the island's northern coast. It's a huge island, but you've got to have it in order to get back to the Philippines. You just do, or at least control of enough of it. So, as I mentioned, Nimitz is moving a lot faster. And this island hopping campaign that, of course, by early 1944, I mentioned Kwajalein earlier, that's in the Marshall Islands. And when the Americans get Kwajalein and also Roy Nimur in the Marshall Islands, it accelerates Nimitz's timetable by about 3 to 4 months or so. And it will allow him in the summer 1944 to launch major operations to secure the Marianas. The importance of that, it's game changing because you're going to have bases from which you can bomb the Japanese home islands with the brand new B-29 bomber that's coming into service. So MacArthur understands all this, and he's concerned that as all this happens, SWAPO is just going to be kind of flank protection, and that the Joint Chiefs in DC and elsewhere will give priority to just have Nimitz go straight for Tokyo. So within the first 4 months of 1944, he makes two bold moves, MacArthur does, that really accelerate his timetable. The seizure of what's called Los Negros and Manus in the Admiralty. So you can see on the inset map where these places are. There's New Guinea, you're sort of slogging across here. If you have air bases here, it provides you excellent air cover and some level of accelerated mobility to move along the northern New Guinea coast. Okay, so in February and March of 1944, based on a combination of aerial photographs, like aerial intel, that MacArthur's outstanding air commander, General George Kenney, was getting for him, and also a brand new weapon that MacArthur has now called the Alamo Scouts. And so these are recon guys who go in to areas like Los Negros to take a look at the actual Japanese presence on the ground. Their job is not to get involved in firefights, because if they do, they're toast. So they're information gatherers, and they're specially trained. They're very motivated volunteers. They give a picture of the Japanese defenses there, and they're going to be doing that through a lot of the Pacific. And it's remarkably similar to what long-range reconnaissance patrols, or LRPs, are going to do in Vietnam a generation later. So MacArthur has kind of a tough decision at Los Negros, because the Alamo Scouts are indicating a larger Japanese presence than the photographs, the aerial photographs. And all he's got is about a battalion-sized unit that he can send in there to grab what's called the Momoti airfield right here, in this part of Los Negros. So the Japanese might outnumber him, but he decides to do it because he thinks he can make a bold strike, he can reinforce, he can catch the Japanese by surprise. And it's really one of his better decisions in the war. Because it does work out, even though it's a close-run thing, in that the Japanese will regroup and they will counterattack against this perimeter here. But the Americans will hold, they'll reinforce, and they'll ultimately win this thing. And one of the reasons is they're going to invade on the eastern coast when the Japanese are expecting the invasion over here on the western coast, which gives them some time and some initiative. So when MacArthur does that, it allows them to get these these airfields, as you see in the Admiralty Islands, and really begin to plan a much more ambitious operation that they pull off a couple months later on April 22nd, 1944, at Hollandia in northwest New Guinea, what's often called Dutch New Guinea in those days. So that is a 2-division operation, the 24th and 41st Infantry Divisions that go in, as you see in this pincers. And the idea here is you're striking in the Japanese rear. Kenny has neutralized a lot of their air power in the area. MacArthur has excellent intel through a series of intelligence coups that I won't get into because that could be a whole story in and of itself. But he has excellent intel on the Japanese order of battle and their dispositions, and so it's just this remarkable outflanking operation that works very well. And of course, the main job now in the wake of this isn't necessarily hard fighting that happens here at Hollandia, but trying to set up airfields and try to set up American staging base, a major base that you can use to move on to the Philippines. And you're carving it essentially out of the wilderness. The beaches, these landing beaches here, I mean, it may look like inviting places, but you can imagine, 10, 20 yards of beach that leads into a swamp, a total sago type swamp kind of thing. You're dealing with a lot of that. So again, imagine the engineering problems that you've got. Imagine the logistical challenges, all of this kind of stuff. So Hollandia is quite a coup, but it's it's obviously going to take many, many weeks to stand up the right kind of basing that you need in order to move on. But this puts MacArthur's theater in the game in terms of keeping up with Nimitz, and it makes possible his return to the Philippines, which he will successfully argue, at a famous meeting with President Roosevelt and with Nimitz and Admiral William Leahy in July 1944, a famous meeting in the Hawaiian Islands, in which MacArthur gets FDR's stamp of approval eventually to go back to the Philippines. And then it really takes another month and a half or so for MacArthur to kind of solidify the sale. But Hollandia makes all of this possible. Okay, so the guy who's going to handle a lot of the ground operations for MacArthur is right here. I mentioned him a moment ago. This is Lieutenant General Walter Krueger. And I picked this slide for a good reason, because this is often what you would see from Krueger. He really liked mixing with average soldiers. He had an ability to have a sort of rapport with them because he cared deeply for them. And his background is just fascinating. When you hear about it, then you won't be surprised to hear that he's so interested in private soldiers. Krueger was actually born in Germany. He's one of only 2 foreign-born U.S. Army generals in World War II. The other was Ben Lear, who was born in Canada. I don't know if that really counts, but in Krueger's case, he was born in Germany. He was the son of a German officer who died when Krueger was a kid. And so Krueger's mother emigrated with him to the U.S., and what's interesting to me, as Chris had mentioned, I live in St. Louis. I come from here. Krueger and his mom came to St. Louis, where there was a major German-American community at that time in the late 19th century. Krueger was born in 1881. And they came here because Krueger's uncle apparently owned a brewery, and that was a microcosm because there were a lot of German-American-owned breweries in the late 19th century in St. Louis. It's a huge part of the economy. So this was a natural place for them to come. And Krueger then has to kind of learn as an adolescent a brand new culture, a brand new language. He is remarkably adept at this. He's an incredible autodidact. So when the Spanish-American War breaks out in 1898, he joins the army as a private soldier at age 17. And he basically starts as a private, and he ends his career half a century plus later as a 4-star general. Completely self-made. Not only no West Point pedigree, no high school diploma. So he's completely self-educated. And yet by the time, he gets a commission when he's serving in the Philippines, by the way, as a young officer, he gets a commission from the field. He ends up like authoring these sort of military intellectual papers. He is multilingual. He speaks Spanish, French, of course, German, and English with hardly a trace of an accent. He was very proud of that. He as I said, he's writing these scholarly articles. He's a completely dedicated soldier. Personality-wise, he's gruff. He's cantankerous. He has this sort of obtuse exterior that masks his really great depth. He's a devoted husband to his wife, Grace, a warm and loving father to his 3 children. And as I mentioned, he's got a major affinity for the average soldier because he used to be one. So he's famous for sort of checking personally to make sure they're properly fed, clothed, looked after. It could be a little uncomfortable if General Krueger visited your unit because he's sort of checking up on you to make sure you're feeding your guys properly or they have dry socks or whatever. He liked to say, weapons are no good unless there are guts at both ends of the bayonet. A close friend once said of him, he clung to what he thought was right with a bulldog's grip. And that was definitely Walter Krueger, So he will end up in command of what's called the 6th Army, which is going to be MacArthur's largest ground formation in the Pacific War. He's not a kid. He's 63 years old in 1944, but MacArthur has personally handpicked him for this job. The other guy right here in the middle, who is MacArthur's key ground commander, I mentioned a moment ago, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, standing here with 2 of his very close trusted aides. This is Clovis Byers, his chief of staff, who was like a brother to him, and Bob Bowen, his operations officer. So Eichelberger will command I Corps. He'll command a corps initially in 1942 under MacArthur. He is, the victor, the first American ground victory in World War II, the Battle of Buna, 1942 and 43. He is really a remarkable soldier on a lot of levels. He's the youngest of 5 children, born to a Union Civil War veteran of world, who had become a lawyer, a very successful lawyer, and was also a gentleman farmer in Ohio. And it was a really happy childhood, except that Eichelberger's dad would sort of pit the siblings against one another, almost like a reality show kind of thing. And as the youngest, it was tough for Bob to compete. He had 3 brothers and 1 sister, and so he wasn't taken very seriously, especially by his father, who thought of him as kind of shallow and lazy, but lovable and all that. And so Eichelberger had this kind of chip on his shoulder to prove himself and to become a success at something. And soldiering was that thing. He went to Ohio State University for a year, and then he left to take an appointment to West Point. So he's in the class of 1909. He finds that he's a good soldier. He graduates in the middle of his class. Like Krueger, he's an infantryman. And unlike many of his peers, Eichelberger didn't serve in France in World War I. He goes to Siberia, what's called the Polar Bear Expedition, an Allied effort to try and squelch the Bolshevik regime, during the Russian Civil War. So Eichelberger saw combat. He served as an intel officer. He got the Distinguished Service Cross. He's also serving alongside the Japanese, and so he observes them very closely. And so he also has a kind of scholarly bent, similar to Krueger. But unlike Krueger, he's a very smooth person in terms of his relations with others. He's genial, he's charming, he's thoughtful. He's just a really enjoyable person to be around with a great sense of humor. And he couldn't fathom being rude to anybody or brusque, or and so you're going to see a real conflict between Krueger and MacArthur, or Krueger and Eichelberger, in part because of the personality differences. Krueger could be so brusque and kind of rude at times, and Eichelberger couldn't fathom that. And Eichelberger is a much more aggressive, maneuver-oriented commander. He's actually very similar to his classmate and good friend, George Patton, with whom he stayed in touch all throughout World War II. And so Eichelberger is a more aggressive type of commander. So as one of his confidants put it, General Eichelberger had a rare way with people. His chemical officer, Harold Riegelman, wrote, his responsiveness and geniality were sparked by a fine sense of humor, his stories on the subtle side, his talent for listening, attentive, and appreciative. He's also very ambitious, and he's sensitive to slights. So already these 2 are emerging as rivals, and MacArthur is going to kind of play on that rivalry, to thrive on it, to play one off against the other. And you're already seeing that in early 1944. You'll see it later when they go back to the Philippines. So after Hollandia, which is Eichelberger's operation, he now oversees the development of this jungled wilderness into like what you're seeing here, and into this major base. As he later wrote, and he was a really good writer. Eichelberger is a gem for historians because he wrote to his beloved wife Emma pretty much every day, sometimes multiple times a day. They had a deep bond. You know, he later on, after the war, gave like dictation, sort of all of his memories of the war and all of his opinions and all this stuff. He wrote a terrific memoir called Our Jungle Road to Tokyo. He was a natural writer and communicator. So he writes about his job at Hollandia. He says, "My job is to direct traffic and road construction and demands speed, speed, speed. Road construction was a gigantic task. Sides of mountains were carved away. Bridges and culverts were thrown across rivers. Gravel and stone fill was poured into sago swamps to make highways as tall as Mississippi levees." So under Eichelberger's supervision, this is like May 1944, Army engineers built 3 major airfields fed by 72 miles of 2- and 4-lane roads. They laid down 135 miles of fuel pipeline to pump aviation gasoline primarily. They constructed 3 million feet of warehouse and building space. And they developed a harbor with like a floating dock, jetties, a 30-ton floating crane, tugboats, motorboats, steel barges, petroleum storage facilities, all this kind of modern stuff in this wilderness. Hollandia could accommodate an impressive 140,000 troops, and the port handled more tonnage, supply tonnage, than any other port in New Guinea. Hollandia represented this unglamorous but vital reality of the Pacific War, that logistics were supreme, and that the Army really had the kind of lead role in ground-oriented logistics. So by the end of the year, 800,000 tons of material was arriving on New Guinea each month. And of course, then this makes possible MacArthur's move to the Philippines, in addition to the naval hardware, of course. So incredible productivity comes at a price. Overwork, exhaustion, low morale, a constant battle with the elements in such an inhospitable place where it's usually hot, it's often rainy, the humidity is high, disease is rife. So as you can imagine, the strain on the overstretched port companies and engineer units was just immense. Many of the soldiers were African Americans, serving in segregated units, working long hours in squalid conditions, occasionally harassed by Japanese air raids, but usually just unloading and moving freight. Tough job, or building roads, or maintaining roads, or repairing them, and doing it, as I said, in segregated organizations, sometimes controlled by white officers, usually not with equal treatment to white units. You know, and basically an example of the sort of larger military policy of excluding African Americans from a combat role, which you tended to see in World War II, though that was beginning to change as you get deeper into 1944 and 1945. But in the Pacific Theater, the vast majority of African American military personnel are working in support-oriented jobs like this and working really hard. They're playing a vital role. So regardless of the distorted racial mores of the time, you know, everyone's in the same boat when it comes to dealing with the miseries of life on New Guinea. This isn't Rome, you know, and wine and restaurants, and this isn't England, you know, with pubs and France where there's people, you know, excited about liberation or something. This is a wilderness, and it's the kind of place where it's hard just to live there or to exist there, much less fight a war or do all these other jobs. So the place seems specially designed by Mother Nature to confound and harass humanity. There were no indigenous waste facilities, so soldiers burned or buried untold tons of noxious garbage or loaded aboard barges for burial at sea. Trenches or 55-gallon drums served as toilets, so you have no sewer system, nothing like that. Luckless privates drew the terrible job of spraying fuel on the offal and burning it. Really another preview of Vietnam. Many Vietnam veterans remember doing that. Temperatures usually in the 80s and 90s, humidity hovering around 90%. It's so hot outside, sweat comes out like water out of a squeezed sponge, one officer wrote to his wife. So mold inundated everything. Equipment molded and rusted quickly. Ammo was soon degraded and ruined. Millions of dollars worth of supplies went to waste. One food shipment at a place called Finsaven, it was just an example of one place. 25% of corned beef and 37% of tomato and fruit juice was found unfit for consumption. That was very common. Engineers purified millions of gallons of stream and river water. What did soldiers eat? Usually canned rations, tinned fruit, tinned vegetables, greasy Spam, Vienna sausages, stomach churning dehydrated potatoes, eggs, and milk. There was a brand of GI butter and especially designed for the tropics. And the good news, it was impervious to melting, but in consequence, it had the consistency of like gelatinous grease. So not quite what you'd want to spread on your bread, So I think anyone on New Guinea would have given his right arm for a glass of cold, fresh milk, quipped Lieutenant Colonel Milton Cloud, a physician with the 367 Station Hospital at Oro Bay. And I think that summed up the feeling of a lot of these guys. Rats and insects plagued the troops. The Pacific Theater, I would argue, was something of an interspecies war, and this was an example of it. The ants are simply exasperating, Sergeant Paul Kinder wrote in a letter to friends. You cannot put anything down but that they find it, anything that one doesn't seal airtight. Where you think of them in the hundreds, I have them by the millions, and from tiny pesky quarter-inch ones on up to about an inch in length of all species and colors. He once made the mistake of leaving a candy bar unattended for an hour. He came back and he found it devoured by the ants. The thing wasn't even there. The swamps and jungles teemed with disease-bearing insects. A new strain of scrub typhus, borne by tiny mites that clung to grass blades, led to an outbreak with a 4% fatality rate. So the doctors were learning as they went, too. Mosquitoes, of course, spread malaria in mass waves, absorbing enormous effort and resources in SWAPA just to prevent the total debilitation of MacArthur's armies. At what point in 1943, the army was losing about 5 guys out of action for mainly malaria, but to disease, for every 1 lost in action against the Japanese. So think about that, 5 to disease for every 1 in combat at that point. The average case was usually not fatal, fortunately, but a guy was, tended to be sidelined for about a month or so when he went to the hospital, and there were usually relapses of malaria. So by mid-1944, you have 47 specially formed anti-malaria units operating on New Guinea. You're going to have twice that by September of 1944. And commanders were expected to ruthlessly enforce anti-malaria measures such as like the wearing of leggings, long sleeves at night, sleeping under mosquito netting, and of course insect repellent, all of which is not terribly popular with soldiers in the tropics. But the number one fix was, of course, pharmaceutical. The taking of atabrine, a drug that suppressed the symptoms of the disease. So medics, sergeants, junior officers were just constantly on their people to, just threatening, ordering them, cajoling them to take their atabrine. So they battle hesitancy, lurid rumors about the drug, how the terrible things it would do to you, that there was something called atabrine psychosis, which was true in rare instances. But the larger rumor that led to reluctance was one of sterility, that it would make you sterile. There was no truth to that. So as a commander, you were dealing with that. Stress must be laid on the fact that atabrine is harmless, one exasperated division surgeon asserted. Temporary neuroses and vomiting may affect a small percentage of those taking atabrine for the first time. He conceded, but he's like, you make them take it. Simple reality is that it worked. The Army was fortunate to have it. So in Milne Bay alone, after the mass administration of atabrine, cases declined from a staggering 3,308 per 1,000 soldiers to a comparatively infinitesimal 31. So atabrine did work, and it really allows MacArthur to continue the pace of his operations, including the ones I've just mentioned. The good news, the Japanese were in far worse shape on New Guinea. They're outflanked by Hollandia. They're increasingly chased from the skies and the seas. Their wayward ground troops are still potent, but they're weakening daily from shortages of food, medicine, other vital supplies. They don't have anywhere near the engineering and supply and quartermaster and transportation know-how that the Allies have. So they've got starvation, malaria, other diseases that are plaguing them as they now wander the island wilderness or rotted away at isolated bases. Many began referring to New Guinea as a green desert, and an eerie phrase circulated among them: from New Guinea, no one comes back alive. One guy shuddered to his diary, and there's tons of really good Japanese diaries that are in the source material. And one of the things I try to do in this series is really give the Japanese perspective, especially the average soldier. And so the diaries help you do that. And this guy wrote, "The fearfulness of living in the jungle cannot be expressed in words. My friends are dead. I'm steadily growing lonely. To end my life at 25 is regrettable. This is my fate. I cannot help it." And then the last entry, he just wrote, "Oh God." Many like him just simply laid down and died. their carcasses soon devoured by jungle animals and insects, decomposing rapidly in the tropical heat. There was no tomorrow, no next day. Private Matsusugo Ogawa, a rare survivor, recalled after the war of his trek through the New Guinea wilderness in 1944. Lack of protein fostered a kind of madness in us. We ate anything, flying insects, worms, and rotten palm trees. We fought over the distribution of those worms. If you managed to knock down a lizard with a stick, you'd pop it into your mouth while its tail was wriggling. There were 7,000 men in his unit, only 67 survived. So desperate though the Japanese were, they can still rob the advance of momentum. Any successful flanking movement can provoke, a reaction, a counterattack type of a reaction. So you're going to see this in New Guinea in the middle part of 1944. So you can see Hollandia here in the middle. There are Japanese garrisons closer to here and over here. So from the east and the west, they're going to try sort of very uncoordinated pincers operations to try and snuff out the American presence. And of course, their great dream would be to destroy the American base at Hollandia or whatever. Now, that's not going to happen. But Macarthur, and really by extension, Krueger and his 6th Army are going to have to expend combat power and take a lot of time in that middle part of 1944, what we think of in the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, it's actually winter in the Southern Hemisphere, and fight these battles on either flank of Hollandia. So one of them here on the western flank that centers around a place called Lone Tree Hill, which is poorly named. There's plenty of trees there, but that's what the Americans call it. So the Army's 6th Infantry Division, and then you see the 158th Regimental Combat Team are going to spend a lot of time fighting there in May and June. And then to the east, the Japanese are going to try a bona fide offensive along the Driniamore River in July and August. And as you see, many American units are going to be absorbed in trying to stop them. So including the 32nd Infantry Division, which of course is in part Wisconsin National Guard. So that's what's happening to sort of slow down something of MacArthur's advance, these sort of untidy flanks and all these kinds of little battles that have to be fought. The Japanese are in rough shape logistically, but they're still potent enough to pose these problems. You're also going to have a new operation as of the end of May at a place called Biak, and that's like the island chain just off the northwest coast of New Guinea. And the thinking here is you need airfields in order to continue your advance to the Philippines. So this leads to a much tougher battle than MacArthur's headquarters had anticipated. He had sent in the 41st Infantry Division to basically take Biak on its own. Eventually has to reinforce them with a regimental combat team from the 24th Infantry Division. You can kind of see delineated on our map here. So Biak is an uneasy harbinger, and it's one of the first times in the Pacific War that you're going to see the Japanese start to use a kind of inland rather than coastal defense. And Biak happens to be honeycombed with a lot of caves. This is just one example of a big cave on Biak. And you can see there's a man, so it gives you a sense. These are men here of the size of this particular cave. So the caves are overlooking some of the key airfield that the Americans want to have. Biak turns into this terrible fight where the 41st Division is sort of bogged down. And the commander right here, Horace Fuller, Major General Horace Fuller, standing here ironically with Krueger, whom he will soon come to hate with a passion. Fuller is just in the middle of this mess. And he's very angry at Krueger for sending him all these messages urging him to speed up and take Biak and all this, because MacArthur's concern is if you don't get Biak quickly enough, then you're not going to be able to continue on to the Philippines in the timetable he wants. Plus, MacArthur had promised to give air support to Nimitz's operations in the Marianas, and he couldn't do that while Biak was still a problem, and so on and so forth. So time is the stressful factor for the Americans. And Fuller becomes so exasperated with Krueger that he decides that he's just going to quit. It's very almost kind of childish in a way. But in the meantime, Krueger and MacArthur have sent Eichelberger in there to try and turn this battle around. Eichelberger is a classmate and old friend of Fuller. He tries to dissuade Fuller from quitting unsuccessfully. And so Eichelberger had just basically run this battle for about a 10-day period, and he's very much a lead from the front kind of commander. And so he gets reinforced, so he's fortunate in that regard. He's going to create a kind of conceive of a kind of pincer style attack, which will have more success than what Fuller had been doing. And he does help turn the battle around in a major way. And so Eichelberger knows he's on the cusp of getting command of his own army, the 8th Army, in the aftermath of this. But he's so angry when he comes back to Hollandia and is greeted brusquely by Krueger that he decides, I want nothing more to do with this guy. And, you have the solidification of the rivalry there. So all this is leading, of course, to MacArthur's grand return to the Philippines, which is here in the midsection at an island called Leyte. You see Luzon, the largest island there, with Manila. Obviously, the southern part of the archipelago here. Leyte is an enormous operation launched on October 20th, 1944. It's 4 U.S. divisions, U.S. Army divisions that are going to go in, and many others in reserve that you see there on the map. It's in terms of the American ground presence, it's larger than the American contribution to Normandy. And yet, of course, Leyte, or Operation King II, as it's known, is nowhere near, obviously, as well known. The naval power behind it is staggering. 738 ships of Vice Admiral Tommy Kincaid's 7th Fleet. You also have Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet. You're going to have, obviously, probably the largest naval battle ever fought, the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 24th and 25th. Okay, so what's happened here? The Japanese feel that this is their one of their last opportunities to completely turn the war around. So they decide when the Americans are going to land at Leyte that they're going to react on air, land, and sea. So you're going to see airstrikes on Leyte from Luzon-based planes and Formosa-based planes, we now call Formosa, Taiwan. And you'll have the naval response, of course, which is the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but you're going to have ground reinforcements that are sent in. When the Americans invade on Leyte, they don't encounter too much resistance initially because there's only 1 Japanese division there, and it's very much in flux. They will reinforce with multiple divisions in the succeeding days. And so both sides are building up their ground strength, and it turns into this kind of this horrendous kind of stalemate operation. The size and scale of the operation is massive. The Americans are landing 1.5 million tons of equipment, over 250,000 tons of combat vehicles, 200,000 tons of medical supplies, 200,000 tons of ammo, just in the initial landing. It's not even the subsequent operations. It's, you're talking 150,000 soldiers. It's just a massive operation. And this kind of enormous attrition style battle fought throughout much of the rest of October, November, into December. The weather is absolutely horrendous. There were 3 typhoons that came in across Leyte within about a 2-week period of the invasion. The road net already is bad, and the infrastructure isn't good. So you can imagine the mud, the flooding, all of this kind of stuff. You've got a humanitarian problem on your hands too, because the Americans are trying to take care of the population. You have here for the first time guerrilla units fighting alongside and as part of U.S. Army units too, and that's going to be a big part of what happens in the Philippines. And it's sort of a harbinger for the Philippines' political future too. But it also shows you Filipinos take a leading role in their own liberation. So you're seeing that beginning at Leyte as well. So it's just the typhoons I mentioned, 35 inches of rain. I just wanted to sort of wrap your mind around that for a minute. Think about that. It's 3 feet of rain that's coming in, over the course of like less than 2 weeks. Major General John Hodge, the 24th Corps commander, which you see on our map there, later said that his men were, quote, never dry from the time they got ashore until the battle was over. Lieutenant Gage Rodman of the 7th Division wrote that the mud was knee-deep and shiny. Every slow spot was a thin soup of dirt and water. Digging a foxhole amounted to digging a bathtub. Tanks, trucks, other vehicles sank, couldn't be recovered. Moving supplies to the front became just an unholy nightmare. Engineers couldn't begin to build stable roads and airfields. It's one of the biggest battles of World War II, so I don't really propose to walk you through the whole thing, but I just want to give you a few key takeaways about Leyte that also, to some extent, reflect the Army in the Pacific at this time frame. The fighting rages, of course, around the clock. Here's the mud, by the way, you can see that. Fighting rages around the clock, small unit actions, mainly over remote stretches of high ground. that, coated the central part of the island. In general, neither side took prisoners. As of December 26, so 2 months after the invasion, when Eichelberger's newly created 8th Army took over the battle, the fighting was still going on long after MacArthur decreed that, quote, only mopping up, that awful phrase that he will often use in the course of the war, that only mopping up was going on. Actually, fighting continued into May 1945. Eichelberger estimated he lost 432 killed and over 1,800 wounded during that so-called mopping up phase. 2. The Americans never really controlled the air. Most of their planes were absorbed in fighting off Japanese air raiders. MacArthur's HQ was bombed many times in the course of this battle. He was remote from the ground fighting because he probably couldn't even physically get there. It's remotely fighting in the mountains. But he's very courageous. And after this experience, though, he resolves never again to launch an invasion without complete control of the air from Kenny's ground-based planes. He's got Halsey helping him, but then Halsey's got to move on, and so he doesn't have full control of the air, and that means those Japanese air raids coming in, bombing his HQ and causing problems with the fleet and all this kind of stuff too. So Leyte was a cautionary tale. 3rd, logistics were a nightmare. Typical division combat needed 300 tons of supplies per day just to subsist, much less attack. Commanders were using ducks, they were using LVTs, LCMs, even carabao draft animals, and carrying parties to keep supplied. They're trying to hire Filipinos, they're trying to coax them, sometimes coerce them to be in these carrying parties. Very few were enthusiastic about that. So this siphons off a lot of your manpower, your combat manpower, to move all this stuff to where it needs to go. It's a constant problem. But as the fighting wore on, the Americans are going to use transport planes to supply. C-47s from the 11th Air Cargo Resupply Squadron parachuted almost 1.2 million tons of supplies during the campaign. Sometimes the units that were really that were cut off in the mountains, but subsisted on these airdrops. So kind of like North Burma in that sense, Merrill's Marauders there earlier in the year. Leyte was a humanitarian operation, as I mentioned. The Americans fed and cared for hundreds of thousands of people. That only added to your logistical concerns. 4th, it began the political transformation of the Philippines, not just to liberate the archipelago from the Japanese, but to decide on its post-independence political struggle, its political realities. And that's a struggle that continued in the 1950s when a communist insurgency came very close to taking over the Philippines. And also, I tend to think that's overlooked too. And if that had happened, that would have been such a major, seminal, devastating event in the Cold War as to equal the loss of Cuba or China becoming communist. Almost, maybe not quite that, but it would have been horrendous. So you're seeing the beginnings of that kind of local political struggle. 5th, of course, disease is rife as usual. But I got malaria coming back, making a comeback, but you also have schistosomiasis now too. Medical evacuation was really difficult. Jeeps and other vehicles could help, but usually it's stretcher teams hauling people back, 4 guys for every casualty. And the Americans also made use of L-4 recon aircraft to move individual wounded, and for the first time, we see helicopter evacuations as well. Lastly, neither side got what it wanted out of Leyte. The Japanese had hoped to win a showdown battle and turn the war around. They're severely defeated. At a minimum, they lose 50,000 KIA in ground fighting on Leyte. In addition, of course, the defeat of their air campaign and obviously the defeat of their Navy at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. These are devastating losses Japan could not afford. And it weakens their defense of Luzon later on. The U.S. lost over 3,500 killed, 12,000 wounded, and 89 missing in the ground fighting. And of course, another 2,500 sailors and aviators killed or wounded. And Leyte, unfortunately, proved almost useless as a base due to its climate, its poor soil, and lousy infrastructure. Also, all you did really is attrit the Japanese. So for posterity's sake, Leyte amounted to little more than a kind of protracted, deadly prelude to more decisive campaigns on Luzon and elsewhere in the archipelago. So by the end of 44, the Army in the Pacific has become one of the mightiest and most sophisticated military forces in human history. The Allies have penetrated Japan's inner defenses now, here and here, and inflicted terrible losses on them, and they now stood on the cusp of administering knockout blows later in 1945. So the Army, of course, is going to serve as a powerful fist for those blows. So I'll stop there. And if you have questions, I would love to entertain them. I appreciate your attention.
Thanks, John. Great talk. If you wouldn't mind, stop sharing your screen, because I know we've gotten some questions, and Molly has actually put them into a slideshow herself, and she's going to put them up on the screen and share them with you. And so with that, Molly, I'll get out of the way and see what kind of questions we got from the audience.
Thanks, Chris, and a great presentation, John. So I'll get those questions right up here. The first one was, which island was the hardest to win on the ground in the Pacific?
Tough question, because there were a lot of tough ones. I think it's a toss-up between Luzon or Okinawa. I mean, the Battle of Okinawa, fought April to June 1945, is just a horrendous, staggering, bitter battle, and that's true. But Luzon is a pretty major struggle for the Army. It comes ashore on January 9th, 1945, in a major invasion. 4 divisions again, and of course the ground presence is going to build up from there. You're going to have a lot of hard fighting that goes on in the hills north of Manila and whatnot. But the Battle of Manila itself is an extraordinarily violent thing, a horrendous, tragic battle. The Battle of Krueger, to retake Krueger also is pretty intense. So I'm talking about, in answering that question that way, I'm talking scale, because certainly if we talk about per capita, we could talk about the Battle of Attu and the Battle of Tarawa as, pound for pound individually as tough as any island to take in the war. But when we're talking about the larger, massive scale that you have on both Luzon and Okinawa, I think maybe they take the prize. Terrible prize though it is.
All right. The next question is, what inspired you to write the books?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always had been, kind of an historian of the Army on some levels, certainly of combat soldiers. And just one of the things that really had occurred to me over time, of studying deeply in World War II and writing about many European theater battles, was this realization of just how extensive the Army in the Pacific truly was, and how relatively overlooked that had been in the World War II literature. Because there's just such a temptation, and I think in some ways, though, the Pacific miniseries was really terrific. It unfortunately reinforced this idea that you basically got a Marine-centered narrative of, well, it's Guadalcanal, and then it's Tarawa, and then the Marianas, and then Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and we're done, or something. And so it occurred to me, it was like, well, wait a minute, the Philippines, you have these 2 major campaigns that are fought there, 41-42 and 44-45. I mean, that's the nexus of the Pacific War, and those are, in terms of the ground fighting, Army campaigns. So over time, that's what really got me quite interested in this, because like any historian, you hope to do something original, something that really either hasn't been done or hasn't been done the same way, or with the same kind of source material or whatever. And happily enough, I just found that there was such an incredible richness of source material available, and I had been gathering a lot over a long period of time too, that I felt this could contribute something.
Excellent. The next one is, was there a unit that you think was considered the most reliable, that the commanders depended on to lead the way?
Yeah, I think one of them, of course there's many, but the one that stands out to me is the 7th Infantry Division. You may remember real early in the presentation, I showed you the image of those guys on Kwajalein that had the unique painting design on their helmets. The 7th Infantry Division did a lot of fighting in the Pacific War. They're the ones who fight in the Battle of Attu in May 1943, which was just an unholy nightmare too, in part because of the conditions. You were losing a lot of guys to trench foot and, of course, combat fatigue and all that. The 7th, of course, then fights at Kwajalein, which is really quite bitter in its own way, though only about a 4-day battle. Then it's going to fight on Leyte and do a heck of a lot of fighting there. And, of course, later on in the Battle of Okinawa as well. So when we look at the Pacific Theater, you don't find too many divisions that are involved in quite that many battles. And I think it's very clear that that was sort of a go-to unit on a lot of levels.
The next one is, did you have any family members that served in World War II?
not on the Pacific. I had an uncle who served in the European theater. It's kind of interesting. He was part of a barrage balloon unit that comes in at after Cherbourg had been taken. So I think probably like July-ish, 1944. And then he transitions away from being in a barrage balloon unit to being in a signals unit. And he spends the rest of his war like repairing radio equipment and tanks and things like that. So he, serves for about a year in the European theater. Doesn't see heavy combat because he's not in, infantry armor or, combat engineers or something. But nonetheless, certainly would have had some level of dicey situations at times. And then eventually goes to college and gets a commission and became a career soldier. This is my Uncle Jack, my father's older brother, and he became a signals officer actually, and retired as a full colonel at Fort Gordon, Georgia, where he lived out the rest of his retirement. So I think World War II was a kind of seminal moment that if it doesn't happen, I don't know that he would have been a career soldier. So I definitely think it had an effect on him.
The last question came from Arthur here. In your experience, is this lack of familiarity in the Pacific theater the exception or the rule? Talking about how many know more about Europe than the Pacific.
I think, unfortunately, it's the rule. The European theater, of course, is the European theater in the sense that it's Europe. We're familiar with these places. It's fascinating. It's important. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily sit here and try and argue against the Germany first strategy. I think it had much to recommend it, but also the European theater presents us in our tough latter year world of so many moral complexities. It presents us with a pretty easy kind of scenario. Adolf Hitler is a thoroughly evil maniac who has to be stopped. The Nazis are terrible on so many levels. All of that just has to be done, and these places like France or whatever certainly have to be liberated, and we're proud that we're a part of that, and rightfully so. The Pacific is a tougher moral dimension of two countries that really were heading toward a conflict, but neither of which has the complete moral high ground. The Americans are tinged with imperialism and the open door in China. The Japanese are becoming, incredibly aggressive and greedy. And of course, the way they fight the war is appalling, in terms of the crimes they commit. But at the same time, it's sort of tougher to wrap your mind around. There isn't one villain to look at or anything like that. And of course, it's fought over so many places that become important in the moment, but are just very backwater places that very few of us would love to visit in this day and age. So whether we're talking about Buna or Vella La Vella or Bougainville or Los Negros or I don't know, even Biak or Leyte or whatever it happens to be, there aren't too many places that you'd say, let's go make a summer of that. So let's go have fun. It's not like going to Normandy or something. So I think maybe that's part of it, and it's totally understandable. But also, when you're talking about 1.8 million American soldiers, there's a lot of us then who have that legacy of those many folks. I've heard from a lot of them since this series comes out. That's one of my favorite things. But also, I think it's too, what you see the Army doing there is all the harbingers for a lot of what we're going to be dealing with in the future. And whether we like it or not, that's just the way the subsequent history is going to go. All of our wars, save for Grenada, Panama, have been fought somewhere on the Asian continent or landmass since World War II. And I think that right there, that maybe the Pacific theater deserves a little more attention.
Okay. We had one more question sneaking at the end. Why didn't Pacific Army leaders become leaders in the Vietnam era?
Well, some did. Most of the senior leaders of World War II are going to be retired by the time of the Vietnam War. So what you're seeing is a lot of guys who were lieutenant colonels, or maybe assistant division commanders, something like that, who are still going to be around as of the Vietnam War. There's one guy named Stanley Larson. And what was so interesting to me, I found a letter that he wrote when he was a general in Vietnam, and he was writing about to his friend Like this is 1966, and he's writing. Excuse me. He's writing about how it reminded him of the Pacific Theater all over again. The conditions, the logistical challenges, the nature of the combat, all of that kind of stuff. So you do see some level of of carryover there.
And that's actually the perfect way to bring it home, John. I think we've exhausted all the questions, but really appreciate having you on for a great presentation. I'm already looking forward to the 1945 book, and we'll definitely have you back, obviously, to talk about that. But I'd like to thank everybody for being here. Keep an eye on our email, keep an eye on our website and Facebook. We've got more great events like this coming up, particularly later this month. Thanks to Molly for her help today. But again, everyone have a great day. And John, thanks again for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everybody.
True pleasure. Thanks, Molly.